All right. This week we're going to talk about our final type of market, and this type of market is called oligopoly. Okay, and so oligopoly is somewhere in between monopoly and, let's say, monopolistic competition. Okay, so it's kind of somewhere in between those two. Um, it's the difference between it and monopoly is not a single seller, but then the difference between it and monopolistic competition is that there's not as many competitors. Okay, but not as many competitors doesn't mean that this kind of market is not necessarily competitive. It just means the way we model it is going to be kind of different. Okay, so let's first take a look at some requirements of this market, or the kind of standards by which we define it. And so the first thing, and this is the key thing, is few sellers. Okay, so there's few sellers, but there are many buyers. Okay, so there's still lots of different buyers, but a few sellers. So this is going to mean that the behavior, there's going to be that these behavior of these sellers is kind of interdependent. Second thing that is kind of interesting, it can be identical or differentiated products. Okay, so even if products are identical, they could still be in an oligopoly if a few firms control the entire market. Okay, so we'll take a further look here. And finally, there are barriers to entry. So this is, in order to get the few sellers, we need barriers to entry, right? So we have barriers to entry, but these are not as high as monopoly. So in the monopoly case, the barriers to entry are so high that only one firm can enter. And in this case, they're high, but not quite as high. Okay, so that's the idea. So they're high, but not quite as high as monopoly case. Okay, so let's take a look at the barriers to entry. Okay, so let's take a look at the barriers to entry. So the barriers to entry is, well, there can be several. So one could be a patent. So just like we had with monopoly, we could have a patent here, but then this patent's a little different. Okay, so an example they give in your book, this I think is a pretty good one, is like if there's three companies have patents for blood pressure medicine. So if you need blood pressure medicine, then your doctor is going to be choosing between these three different types of medicine to prescribe to you. And so again, then these three companies are competing against each other. So in this case, the patent didn't create a monopoly, but it did create a market with few producers, because other people are not allowed to come in and produce these same product without getting permission. Another one, if we have really strong branding. Okay, so we talked about branding in the monopolistic competition case. So if we have really strong branding, that can create a market. Well, this is called market power, right? So maybe there's a few big players in this market, and the small firms, they cannot advertise enough to enter. Okay, so new companies that want to enter, they cannot advertise enough to enter and compete. Okay, so I'll give you a real world example of that. And that would be the market that has Coke and Pepsi, the soft drinks market. Okay, so it's relatively hard for a small player to enter this market. The Coca-Cola company and the PepsiCo company dominate the market for soft drinks. And part of the reason they dominate the market is because of advertising. So for some of the drinks that they make, for example, the Coca-Cola and Pepsi, it's not actually very hard to make a cola. Lots of people could do it. Lots of companies could make cola, but the hard part is to compete with them on branding. Okay, so it's the branding of their product is so strong, and they spend so much money on advertising that a small firm will have a really hard time to compete with them. So that provides their barrier to entry. And then the third one we're going to talk about here, we could do more, is something we talked about before, and that's economies of scale. Okay, so economies of scale. So then remember, economy of scale is when the bigger you are, the lower your long run average costs are. Okay, so that's when we have economies of scale. So if we have that few firms, just having a few firms, like 4 or 5 firms, let's say, are enough. A few firms are enough to serve the entire market. Okay, so basically the minimum size for a firm is large, right? And once you have a few of them, then they can serve the entire market. And smaller firms have higher average cost. Okay, so an example here might be Boeing. Okay, so there's other companies that can produce planes, but it's producing on the scale. You have to reach a certain scale in order to be competitive. Okay, and so one of the limitations to enter this market. There's other ones, but one of the limitations may be this economies of scale. Okay, so we get the idea. There could be other things. So the key point here is for there to be this type of market where we have few sellers. And when I say few, this could be anywhere from 2 to like 6 or 7, right? Or 10 even, if still there's a concentration in the top. And we need some kind of thing to keep people out. Because if there wasn't somebody to keep people out and this market was profitable, then we would see many, many, many sellers. Okay. The next video, we're going to come back and talk about how to analyze this type of market.